So moving on to our second plenary speaker, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mark Ratain. Mark's Leon Jacobson Professor of Medicine and Director of the Center for Personalized Medicine at Chicago University. And he runs the Chicago Phase 1 unit there with more than 300 publications to his name. Mark's a graduate of Harvard and Yale, trained at Johns Hopkins before he moved to Chicago. Numerous accolades, including a translational research professorship from ASCO. He's a visiting professor at the FDA and a co-founder of VI3C, Value in Cancer Care Consortium, which I'm sure he'll talk about. On a personal note, Mark over the years has told me a great deal of what I know about pharmacology, with his indomitable style of being clear about my sloppy thinking, but always with great charm and often over a good meal, whether that's at his own home in Chicago, or if you want to know an interesting place to eat in any city in the world, probably Mark is, it's another of his many talents. Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here to talk about a new discipline, interventional pharmacoeconomics. You're probably wondering, what is that? I will explain it to you shortly. I want to start with my declaration of relevant interest, however. I have provided expert testimony in patent litigation consulting on behalf of multiple generic pharmaceutical companies. As my wife says, when the car bomb goes off, nobody will know who did it. And I am director and treasurer of the Value in Cancer Care Consortium. This is a negative financial interest. It's completely supported by its directors, one of whom, Ian Tannick, is here in the audience. But anybody who would like to contribute, we will take your money. The website is www.vi3c.org. All right, so here's an article, Financial Times, April 9, 2018. Why do new medicines cost so much, and what can we do about it? Okay? So I'm here to tell you what we can do about it. And we're not going to talk about price, we're going to talk about cost. And there's a big difference, of course. Price is what you pay per unit, and cost is what you pay in total. So we just published an article in JAMA Oncology, and you see my co-authors here, Dan Goldstein and Alan Lichter. Alan is, of course, the past Chief Executive Officer of ASCO and currently chairs the Value in Cancer Care Consortium. And we described this new concept of interventional pharmacoeconomics, a new discipline. So this is why you've not heard of this before, unless you read this paper that was recently published. Now, this is not what we're doing, but it's an interesting solution. This comes from Salt Lake City, an article last year published in the Salt Lake Tribune describing an innovative pharmacy tourism program of the Public Employees Health Plan of Utah. Okay, Utah, as some of you may know, is a very conservative state, but yet they've decided that to fight high drug prices, they're going to offer patients the opportunity to go to Mexico. And since drugs are cheaper in Mexico, and the Utah Public Employees Health Plan will cover transportation to San Diego, ground transportation to Tijuana, and a $500 cash payout for the trouble for patients who need certain expensive drugs for multiple sclerosis, cancer, and autoimmune disorders. Okay, so that's one solution. That's not ours. This is why it's not just a problem in the UK. This is the evolving cost crisis in the United States. These data come from something called the Oncology Care Model, which is an experiment of Medicare in the United States. And these are old data. These are data from 2016 to 17, and this represents the breakdown of costs for medical oncology care, care provided by a medical oncologist for patients who are generally receiving treatment or who have completed treatment. What you see is that almost 60% of the total cost of care is drugs, okay? 6% goes to the physician for their expertise, and almost 10 times that goes to the pharmaceutical industry for providing drugs. This is the way the world looked in 2017, that going forward, that the spending the revenues for oncology therapies were expected to grow at a compound annual growth rate of 13% globally over the period 2017 to 2022. And this 2017 article projected that PD-PD-L1 therapies would bring in close to $30 billion in revenue globally. Okay? This creates a tremendous cost issue. So as I said, interventional pharmacoeconomics, it's not about price regulation. It's a free market solution to the problem of high costs of modern therapeutics. So I'm not an economist, but I work on a campus that has some of the best economists in the world. And the University of Chicago economists are known for devising free market solutions to the world's problems. So here I am to talk to you about a free market solution to the high cost of drugs. And the goal is to reduce prescribing costs through development of new therapeutic regimens, applying clinical pharmacology to enhance drug value. I am a clinical pharmacologist. I am not an economist. So here are the 4 general strategies, and I'm not going to have time to go through all of these today. You can read our commentary and some of our other publications to see some specific examples beyond those I talk about. Number 1, of course, is substituting a therapeutic alternative that is cheaper and has comparable efficacy. Number 2 is probably the most important one, using lower dosages with comparable efficacy. Most of you are aware that oncology drug development has focused on defining the maximally tolerated dose in phase 1 trials. And then with a belief that more is better, utilizing that maximally tolerated dose throughout subsequent drug development, making assumptions that it's the best dose therapeutically, and that patients don't really mind the toxicities, and that oncologists are comfortable managing the toxicities. Of course, it may have made sense for chemotherapy, and that is debatable to some degree, but it makes little sense that once you've completely blocked a target, that giving more drug is better. Less frequent dosing is another alternative, primarily to deal with the fact that the pharmaceutical industry markets their products in a way to try and impede the use of lower dosages. For example, many parenteral drugs are marketed in single-dose vials. Many oral drugs, at least in the United States, have the same price regardless of unit dose. So that one strategy is just to give the drug less often and thereby cut costs. And then for many regimens, we don't really know how long to treat. And so there are many opportunities to study shorter duration of dosing, and studies are ongoing now in regard to the PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitors, and of course, duration of dosing of trastuzumab has been an area of great interest, and studies have been done here in the UK as well. So the proof of concept for what I'm talking about actually comes from ophthalmology. And this is a 2011 paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, a phase 3 trial comparing ranibizumab and bevacizumab. Bevacizumab, of course, is not approved for macular degeneration, never has been, but this study was done because of evidence that it worked, and the evidence was developed by the ophthalmological academic community. And ranibizumab is known as Lucentis and is also marketed and was developed by Genentech. I believe it's marketed by Novartis here in the UK. And the NIH, the National Eye Institute, funded this randomized trial, which showed no difference in efficacy. And at the time, there was a 40-fold difference in cost. $2,000 was the standard cost for ranibizumab, the on-label, FDA-approved product, and $50 per dose was what was required if you repurposed bevacizumab, Avastin, which oncologists think of as an expensive drug, but when used very small amounts and you inject into the eye, it's a very cheap drug. So this led to significant success. This is a 2017 paper looking back, and off-label bevacizumab is the most prescribed anti-VEGF drug by US ophthalmologists. That's the blue line, and the other two curves represent the on-label marketed products that within FDA indication. So the ophthalmologists have done this, and they've done it to save money. Okay? In the UK, it's been a little different. So 2012, the NHS wanted to utilize bevacizumab off-label, and effectively Novartis took legal action and to block it. And as I said, Novartis has the license from Genentech for the product. And here's another story. This is from 2015. Drug company bullied doctors to block cheap treatment for sight loss that could have saved NHS £100 million a year. So they took a non-legal action. But finally, it looks like the good guys won. This is the BMJ, September 24th, that the drug regulator has decided that it's appropriate for NHS ophthalmologists to now use off-label bevacizumab for the treatment of macular degeneration. So it took many years to get to this point. All right, so our proof of concept on oncology was this study using a drug discovered in England at the ICR, abiraterone, an inhibitor of CYP17A. The drug is approved in combination with prednisone for a variety of prostate cancer indications. And it's been well known for years the drug is better absorbed with food, yet the company, the original company that developed the drug in the US and globally was Cougar Pharmaceuticals, which was eventually acquired by Johnson & Johnson, and they developed the drug under fasting conditions, and the drug was approved at a dose of 1,000 milligrams taken on an empty stomach daily. So instead, we hypothesized that giving 1/4 of that dose with food would be sufficient to achieve efficacy. And our concept was also supported by the phase 1 data that showed no evidence of dose response, basically. And in this small randomized trial, it was a multi-center trial and it was international because the Singaporeans joined us, we randomized 72 patients to these two arms, 250 versus 1,000. You don't need to be a statistician to see that the two arms were identical. In fact, if I were trying to promote that 1,000 was better than 250, I would have a tough time. 250 actually looks a little better. So here's evidence that 1/4 the dose works just fine, a quick 75% savings. Instead of taking 4 a day on fasting, men can take 1 a day with food. So the question was, what do we do next? And one of the things we did was we submitted a proposal to the NCCN, which is an entity in the United States, a network that one of the things it does is it authors guidelines for the treatment of cancer, and it's recognized by payers as an authority. And Ian Tannick led this effort. And we basically proposed that the NCCN should include in its guidelines 250 milligrams a day with food as an alternative to the labeled dose of 1,000. Okay? So this was submitted in October 2018. 12 days later, another thing happened, which was the existing use patent, method of use patent for abiraterone, which was combining abiraterone and prednisone, was deemed to be invalid in the United States as being obvious to add prednisone to abiraterone. And a federal judge ruled that the patent was invalid. For reasons I don't understand, there's still a valid patent in the UK for the combination of abiraterone and prednisone. So you do not yet have generic abiraterone in this country. Meanwhile, in March 2019, the NCCN approved this submission that Dr. Tannick submitted on behalf of the Value in Cancer Care Consortium. And so therefore, we now have, as of March 2019, the ability to prescribe low-dose generic abiraterone for the treatment of prostate cancer. And the list price now is $800, and that's less than 10% of the cost of enzalutamide and any other competing products. So clearly success, and I will tell you now that many oncologists in the United States, if they write a prescription for 1,000 milligrams a day of abiraterone, get a call from the insurance company and say, have you considered just using 250 milligrams a day and giving it with food? In May of this year, the city of Baltimore filed suit against Janssen because of the sham patents around abiraterone. So kicking it up a notch now. And this was followed soon thereafter by a lawsuit filed by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Louisiana. So that not only are payers now in the United States willing to fight, they're willing to litigate against the pharmaceutical industry. Now, you may be wondering, what can you do here in the UK? You still have to pay the list price that the company sets, and you negotiate well at the NHS. But again, one thing you can do is just give it less often. Instead of giving it daily, give it every other day, give it every third day, or maybe even once a week. Because in this original phase 1 trial conducted by Ian Judson and colleagues at the Marsden, they showed that the effects of a single dose of abiraterone persist for a week. These are the changes in testosterone, and you can see this drug is a very potent inhibitor. So we have not planned to conduct such studies in the United States, since we've now gotten the cost down to $800 a month. But if there are any investigators here that want to try and reduce the cost of abiraterone, here's a proposal for you: decrease the frequency of abiraterone dosing. All right, now let's switch gears, and I will tell you there are many examples I could have given, but this is one of my favorite ones, nilotinib. Nilotinib is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor for CML. It's the second generation to imatinib. This was developed by Novartis, basically as imatinib was going generic. And what you see here is what we call in the United States a black box warning. So this is part of the label, and a black box warning is the highest kind of warning that the FDA can put on a label to inform prescribers of the risk of a drug. And the black box warning relates to the risk of cardiac toxicity, particularly sudden death. The sudden death that is being warned about here is due to ventricular arrhythmias, and the ventricular arrhythmias are due to the effects of the drug on the QT interval, okay? So that's the conduction through the heart. And so the black box warning informs the prescriber that nilotinib prolongs the QT interval and that sudden deaths have been reported, and then informs the prescriber of all the things that they can do to reduce this risk: can correct the potassium, correct the magnesium, be concerned about other drugs that you're giving. And then highlighted in red is something that you will not find in any other black box warning for any other drug: that patients should avoid food 2 hours before and 1 hour after taking the dose. Okay? It's a black box warning for food in conjunction with this drug. Okay? Really previously unheard of. And the reason for that is that food increases the absorption of this drug, and patients are told to take the drug fasting, and the reason they're told to take the drug fasting is just because of this black box warning. So the prescriber says take it fasting, and the patients are told that if they take it with food, there's a cardiac risk. So what this black box warning is really telling the patients: if you take nilotinib with breakfast, you might die. Okay? You will not find this in any other drug label. And I guarantee if you ask any patient if they were informed to take a drug fasting, if they took it with food, could they die? I don't think any patient, any reasonable patient, would expect that to be a reasonable risk. And there's a simple remedy: take half the dose with food. Okay? Food doubles the absorption. Yet neither the FDA nor Novartis has chosen to revise the label to do the necessary trials to demonstrate that a half dose taken with food is just as effective. For a disease, CML, in which patients may take the drug for decades, fasting twice a day to avoid playing Russian roulette okay? Amazing. All right, here's another example. This is about ibrutinib. Ibrutinib is a BTK inhibitor, Bruton's tyrosine kinase. Initially approved in 2013. This is from a label from a few years ago. It actually has more indications now, but this label describes its usage for mantle cell lymphoma, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, Waldenström's macroglobulinemia. And at the time of this label, there was only one formulation available, 140 milligram capsules. And you see that the dosage is 420 milligrams for the more common diseases, CLL and Waldenström's, 560 milligrams for mantle cell lymphoma, which was the first indication. The patients are told to take it orally with a glass of water. There's no information about food. The trials were done without concern for food, although food does actually increase the absorption of this drug, although not twofold. So they got the dose of 560 because that was the maximally tolerated dose when they did the phase 1. And the they, in this case, being pharmacyclics, the original drug PCI 32765, pharmacyclics, was a small company in California. They've been acquired by AbbVie, but prior to being acquired, they negotiated a licensing agreement with Janssen. So the drug today is marketed by Janssen, but technically the product is owned by AbbVie, and the two companies split the revenue and presumably make decisions jointly. And so you see here the relationship between dosage and BTK occupancy. It's an irreversible inhibitor. So BTK occupancy is a pretty good biomarker. And basically what you see is that the target is saturated at pretty low dosages. Here's the clinical pharmacology review by FDA, and you can find these online for any drug. And this is from when the product was submitted for approval back in June 2013. It went through a full review, and this was for the original 560 milligram dosage regimen. Here's what the FDA told the applicant. We recommend you evaluate lower doses of ibrutinib in future clinical development as data from the phase 1 trial, the one I just showed you, showed the maximum BTK occupancy and maximum response were achieved at doses of greater than or equal 2.5 milligram per kilogram. And then the review also demonstrated that there was no exposure-response relationship when patients received a dose of 560 milligrams, no surprise. In other words, your dose is just too high. The FDA told them the same thing again when they submitted their application for CLL at a dosage of 420. And the company, or companies in this case, now AbbVie and Janssen, have never pursued the lower dosage. Investigators at MD Anderson, in contrast, have. This paper was published in Blood earlier this year, a pilot study of lower doses of ibrutinib in patients with CLL. And here the investigators chose to de-escalate intentionally cycle by cycle, starting at 420 and de-escalating 280 and then 140. And what they demonstrated was they maintained BTK occupancy as would be expected, and their efficacy biomarkers CCL3 and BTK phosphorylation were also similarly maintained. They also demonstrated a decreased effect on platelets at the lower dose based on platelet function testing. So this pilot study demonstrated that de-escalation was certainly a reasonable strategy and could maintain efficacy. Meanwhile, the company has been doing what it can do to keep prescribers from prescribing lower dosages. So they decided that taking 340 milligram capsules per day was inconvenient. And so they came out with new tablets of 280, 420, and 560 milligrams so that patients wouldn't have to take multiple capsules. What they were really planning to do was to take the 140 milligram capsules off the market and force prescribers to choose one of these, which were, of course, all priced the same price as 340 milligram capsules. Today, what you have is you have the capsules on the market, and you have a 142 milligram tablet in the United States costing 3 times the price of a 140 milligram capsule. but they kept the capsules on the market. Then you see this paper just published in the cardiology literature, Journal of the American College of Cardiology, cardiovascular toxicities associated with ibrutinib. 303 ibrutinib-associated cardiovascular deaths, okay? Supraventricular arrhythmias, ventricular arrhythmias, conduction disorders, heart failure, hypertension, CNS ischemic events, CNS hemorrhagic events. It's been well known that the drug causes atrial fibrillation, which most oncologists go, okay, that's not fatal, and when we get it, we'll have to call a cardiologist. But nobody's really thinking that this drug is killing people. What's really scary is the time to onset. When you see many of these events occurring in the first month, conduction disorders, complete heart block, okay? These are at a dosage of 420 milligrams in the first month. Patients, there won't be time to de-escalate. So as much as I admire the MD Anderson investigators, it seems to me a better strategy is to actually start at a dosage that the FDA recommended in its review, although the advice was not taken, which is 140 milligrams a day. I will tell you there will be reluctance by the companies to pursue a dosage of 140 milligrams per day. Their method of use patents for CLL and mantle cell lymphoma all state using a dosage of 420 milligrams per day in the primary independent claim, and so a lower dosage actually would not give them patent coverage. So where are the regulators? Who's going to step in now? We have 300 plus deaths. Okay, 5 years ago, the FDA told the company use a lower dose. Or even better, where are the class action? I think in the UK you call them group litigation lawyers. So if anybody has any friends that are group litigation lawyers, let them know that there's a good opportunity here. All right, well, let's move on to checkpoint inhibitors. This is clearly a huge success, exciting, and it's going to break the bank globally. So my friend Dan Goldstein, who's in Israel, and I wrote this paper, Time is Money, Optimizing the Scheduling of Nivolumab. And we basically suggested that we can use less nivolumab or alternatively give the standard dose of nivolumab less often. And one of the justifications for that was data generated by the company and then ignored. This is a paper from the Journal of Clinical Oncology looking at nivolumab at 3 different doses in metastatic kidney cancer. 0.3, 2, and 10 milligrams per kilogram every 3 weeks. No difference, over a 30-fold dose range. Instead, they only explored the higher dosages. So it's pretty obvious that the dosage is too high. So as we think about what to do, we have to remember access is a potential problem. So here's the recent news from the NHS. Immunotherapy drug for triple-negative breast cancer rejected for NHS use. This is not nivolumab. This is Genentech's atezolizumab, a PD-L1 inhibitor. And the recommended dosing regimen is every 2 weeks in combination with nab-paclitaxel. And NICE recommended against the drug on the basis of cost, or against the combination. But I'd like to propose a win-win, and I don't know if anybody from Roche is in the audience, but I'm sure the NHS would love to hear from you. Low-dose atezolizumab would surely be the most cost-effective PD-1 pathway inhibitor, and let me show you why that will work. So, there's a paper recently published by Morrissey et al. In Cancer Chemotherapy and Pharmacology, and it basically describes the pharmacokinetics of atezolizumab on a variety of different doses and schedules. And so the proposed dosage of atezolizumab for the NHS is 840 milligrams every 2 weeks. And what you see is at steady state that the minimum mean concentration, the mean minimum, is 226 micrograms per mil. And if you look at 90% confidence intervals, or 90%, not confidence intervals, but percentiles, that the 90th percentile, the 90% of patients will have a concentration of 118 and above, okay? So just remember that, 118 and above. The company reported that its target steady state concentration was 6, okay? So in this 2016 paper, they said based on the interim, and this is their old name for atezolizumab, on the interim PK data in humans, the minimum dose to maintain a steady state trough, which is what I just showed you, of at least 6, in at least 90% of patients, is 4 milligrams per kilogram every 3 weeks. So they said they want to have 90% of patients at 6 or above. You read this paper, the reason they were targeting 6 is they wanted to combine it with bevacizumab. And they said in the paper, if we don't have bevacizumab, the target is 4. Okay, so the company's target steady state concentration was 6, and that's 5% of the 10th percentile Cmin at 840 every 2 weeks, 5%. Okay, now these are single dose vials, so you'd have to line up 20 patients at a time, or figure out how to share vials in some other way, but you can treat 20 patients with a vial. Okay? Or you could treat 10 patients with a vial every 4 weeks, for example. So at 1680 every 4 weeks, you have a mean of 182, and the 90th percentile is 87. So again, if you treated 20 patients at 5% of that, 84 milligrams every 4 weeks, you'd be above 4 in 90% of patients. And you don't only need to share the vial among 10 patients, actually. Or there's another strategy that we propose in an editorial to this paper, alternative dosing regimens for atezolizumab, right dose, wrong frequency. Because they're single dose vials, we said, well, let's just change the frequency. So we can just give 840 milligrams PRN. Just measure the levels. When it looks like the trough's going to get under 6 or maybe under 4, give another dose. Okay? So it's a lot cheaper to do therapeutic drug monitoring of atezolizumab than to buy the drug from the company and, of course, have to give these extra infusions to patients. So how do we fund these studies? We are wondering this. We do have a paper coming out in Health Affairs blog on some funding models, but there's direct government support, which would be nice, except in the United States, the NIH is not allowed to fund studies to reduce costs. That's because pharma owns Congress in the United States. There's philanthropic contributions. That was the original business model for VI3C. People all over the world would love to give us money to run trials. Everybody said, what a great idea, go talk to so-and-so. Then there's repurposing of drug costs within a single closed healthcare system, such as the NHS. NHS, I will tell you, I've met with them, they love this idea. They say, we just need the investigators to come to us and we'll figure out how to get these studies funded. Or consortia studies, which could be a consortium of payers and pretty much achieve the same thing, and maybe the NHS could be the lead for a global consortium. So let's just look at some numbers. So within a single closed healthcare system, such as the NHS, IVP, that stands for Interventional Pharmacoeconomics Studies, are self-funding. So I've used here the actual NHS list price, okay, because the true price is confidential, but the list price for ibrutinib at 420 milligrams per day is 4,600 pounds a month, which is 153 pounds per day. So if one had an experimental arm of 420 milligrams per day, the cost would be 51 pounds per day. And if you ran a randomized trial where half the patients got the standard dose and half the patients got the experimental dose, you would actually have an average cost per drug in that trial of 102 pounds per day, and you would actually save 51 pounds per day on drug costs while you're running the trial, and that's 1,500 pounds a month per patient, and that more than easily covers the cost of the research. So as the NHS said to me, we don't mind doing really large trials. And I said, I bet you'd like a 10-to-1 randomization in favor of the experimental arm. They said, that would be really lovely. So there's a big opportunity here because you have a single payer system. Take advantage of it. So in conclusion, interventional pharmacoeconomics can reduce prescribing costs for dozens of anti-cancer agents without price regulation. I've just given you a taste of this. There are numerous strategies to fund and conduct interventional pharmacoeconomic studies, particularly in the context of single-payer systems such as the NHS. And if you want to hear more, Dan Goldstein and I are organizing the first international summit on interventional pharmacoeconomics in Tel Aviv in March. So thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mark. As Claire said, there's microphones around the room, and we've also got questions coming through the app, which is why I've had to stand up, because my eyes are not good enough to read the writing on that. But before asking one of the questions, Mark, I was going to ask, don't we as phase 1 doctors have some of the responsibility for this? We need to sort out how we do our trials as well.
Well, you're absolutely right, Ruth. In the good old days, the companies actually cared about what we had to say. These days, one gets approached by a CRO, and we have little or no input into the design of these trials. And so, you know, it's limited my enthusiasm for doing these trials because the science isn't there anymore. But you're right. We could, as investigators, refuse to do dumb trials, but they'd find someone else to do it.
On that depressing note, I'm going to ask one of the first questions here. So this is from Stuart Griffiths. It says, I'm no expert or even novice when it comes to global drug pricing, but what is stopping companies putting up prices when new treatment regimens are recommended?
Well, I mean, so that's absolutely true, that if a company develops a drug correctly today and develops a drug at the optimal dose, they will set a price that they like, and there won't be an opportunity to reduce it. On the other hand, for all the drugs we already have that are going to be patent protected, in some cases for decades, we can do these kinds of studies as investigators that will be off-label dosing, and for which the companies would find it pretty difficult to increase prices for an off-label dose, because it would make the on-label dose completely unaffordable. And so unless the companies want to go through and do these trials themselves, they're not going to be able to increase prices for marketed drugs. But I'd be happy in a world in which all drugs were labeled at the optimal dose and patients were not having undue toxicity from unnecessarily high doses, including the fatalities I showed you for ibrutinib.
Thank you. Microphone 1.
Mark Lawler from Queen's University Belfast. We've been doing some work in Central and Eastern Europe and looking at health economics in that setting. One of the worrying things we've just finished a survey in 33 European countries in relation to the economic burden of colorectal cancer. And one of the things we've seen in several Eastern European countries is that the pharmaceutical costs far outweigh the hospital costs. And that's not, as you can imagine, at all reflected in outcomes, etc. And so it's a really worrying trend that we're seeing and trying to understand it in terms of, and use it to try and change policy really in those countries. But it's sort of reflected in some of what you said in relation to what you're seeing in the States as well. But it's particularly worrying there because obviously the value perspective and the budget is obviously much smaller, and if you're spending a lot of your budget on pharmaceutical costs, presumably you're not actually investing in radiotherapy, surgery, etc.
Yes, and I think it's going to dissuade eventually physicians, for example, from going into medical oncology, just because to work so hard to just make money for the pharmaceutical industry, at some point the payers are going to do something, and the most obvious place to squeeze are the physicians, because generally they're not united.
Thank you.
So Mark, I've got a question here from Una McMenamin. Is there a role for pharmacoepidemiological studies using real-world health records alongside trials to answer some of these questions?
Well, I think that's a good question, and it's sort of, that would be feasible if there were enough off-label dosing and one could then compare. I think, for example, it should be possible in the next few years to compare the outcomes with low-dose abiraterone versus standard abiraterone. And I know there's been some usage of low-dose PD-1 inhibitors in East Asia. These studies have been, case series been published, and low-dose ibrutinib, a small case series, been published out of India. But I think I think we really need randomized trials. We don't need big randomized trials. So those I pointed out to the NHS, the larger the trial, the more money they can save. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here in Britain to do these studies.
And to finish with a provocative question from somebody who's just put themselves as S and not one of our political leaders, it says, surely nationalising the pharmaceutical industry is the solution here.
Well, as I've said, pharmaceutical industry ideally will solve this problem for themselves, or somebody else will solve it for them. So I would prefer that they solve it.
And on that note, thank you very much, Mark.
Yeah. I think we can get down and we have to get